Luke Skywalker spent the first 19 years of his life on Tatooine, raised by his father's stepbrother Owen Lars and his wife Beru. As an infant, Luke was brought to Tatooine by Obi-Wan Kenobi after the rise of the Empire. In order to keep him safe from the Emperor and Darth Vader, his existence was kept secret. And during Luke's childhood, Obi-Wan Kenobi lived as an exile on Tatooine, keeping a close eye on the son of Darth Vader. Now, this could make sense because 3 years before Anakin's fall to the dark side, he actually met Owen Lars and went to the Lars moisture farm. Anakin visited them when he was still a Jedi Padawan during his mission to protect Padme. These events all take place in Attack of the Clones, and this is where he discovered his mother had been captured and killed by the Tusken Raiders. After bringing her body back, Anakin buried her on the Lars moisture farm. And years later, as Darth Vader, Anakin would experience moments of suffering as he remembered his past and everything that Sidious had taken from him. What if, during one of these low moments of deep suffering, Darth Vader decided to visit the grave of his mother? Doing this between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, which I think is reasonable to think, would bring Vader face to face with his son Luke Skywalker. Now, in the 2020 Vader comics, he actually does visit Tatooine. It's a really deep scene where Vader walks through the farm and remembers all of the things that happened during his first visit to the Lars home. It's a really cool moment that highlights the difficult tension between the cold, calloused Darth Vader and Anakin Skywalker. However, this comic takes place after the Empire Strikes Back, after Darth Vader has just revealed his identity to Luke. Having failed to convince Luke to join him, and Luke escaping on the Millennium Falcon, Vader turns his attention to figuring out who it was that hid Luke from him and thus made him weak. How would the story of Star Wars change had Vader made a visit to the Lars farm before the events of A New Hope? So with that backdrop in mind, let's jump in. Vader arrived on Tatooine alone. Personal matters like this were best kept from the Emperor. He was only accompanied by 2 Death Troopers and the shuttle pilot. It had been 10 years since his defeat on Mustafar, 10 years since Kenobi, the Jedi, Palpatine, and everyone else took everything from him. Now he was a servant of the dark side, slave to his suffering. Vader approached the modest farm. The twin suns had just set on the desert planet, and only Vader's breathing could be heard. From a distance, he could hear the voice of Beru Lars calling a name into the distance, Luke. Vader watched as a young boy ran from a moisture evaporator to the main building. Vader sensed that the Force was strong with this child. Even from a distance, there was something familiar about him. He commanded one of the 2 Death Troopers he had brought with him to return to the shuttle and check for birth records of any children Owen and Beru may have had. Swiftly, Vader moved toward the entrance to the Lars home. He briefly glanced toward the spot Shmi Skywalker had been buried almost 13 years earlier, and he was enraged to see that the header marking her grave had been covered by a layer of sand. Fueled by anger, Vader used the Force to blast down the front entrance of the home. The Death Troopers then moved in quickly and apprehended Owen, Beru, and the mystery child. The trooper who had gone to look into the birth records then handed a datapad to Vader. Vader looked at the datapad to read an excerpt from an unorganized Mos Eisley database. The information revealed that Owen and Beru had adopted a boy named Luke Skywalker. The year they had done that was the same year Padme had died, the same year she would have given birth. Vader was perplexed. How could this be? Padme died before giving birth, according to Palpatine. But it all made sense. This connection to the boy he sensed earlier, the name Skywalker, the fact that he was with the closest thing Anakin had to a family. Padme had been alive long enough to give birth. He felt it. It was the Emperor that lied to him. Vader looked up from the datapad to stare at the small boy that was hiding behind Owen. This was his son. Vader called out to the boy to come toward him, but he did not budge. Lars seemed to plant his feet as if to say the boy is not going anywhere, as if Owen Lars could stand in the way of Darth Vader. Without a word, the Death Troopers moved forward and grabbed Owen and Beru. Vader knelt down in front of the boy, Luke. He must have been 9 or 10. the same age he was when the Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn took him from Tatooine. Just as Qui-Gon had, Vader would give this boy a new path, a path to great power. After a few tense moments, Vader grabbed Luke by the hand and took him from the house. The Death Troopers hung back with Owen and Beru, and in only a few moments, the house was lit with blaster fire. Vader continued toward his Lambda-class shuttle that had just landed only meters away from the house. Approaching the shuttle, he felt another presence, one he had not sensed since the fire of Mustafar. Just like all of those years before, Darth Vader looked at the top of the shuttle ramp to see Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the shuttle pilot lay at his feet unconscious. Darth Vader let go of Luke and ignited his lightsaber. At last, he would have a chance to destroy his old master. Vader looked at Obi-Wan. "When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master." "Only a master of evil," Kenobi replied. The clash of lightsabers lit up the desert night. Vader could feel the powerful connection to the Force that Obi-Wan had, but his abilities with a lightsaber had diminished with age. Soon, Darth Vader began to overpower the old Jedi. This time, Vader's arrogance would not get in the way of defeating Kenobi. After parrying a string of attacks from his opponent, Vader saw his opening. Kenobi moved slower, and it left an opening for Vader to exploit. The towering Sith slashed at Obi-Wan's side, landing his blow. Obi-Wan fell to the ground. He was only wounded, and Vader looked down at him for a moment, briefly remembering their time as master and apprentice, and then his memory was flooded with images of his mother, Padme, and the future he could have had. But those were weak memories. Those were the memories of Anakin Skywalker. Casting them out, Vader gripped Kenobi with the Force and threw him through the front door of the home, and then turned to take Luke aboard the shuttle. Soon, he would learn to appreciate the power that was just demonstrated before him, Vader thought. As the ramp to the shuttle was closing behind them, Vader turned around to look at the nasty Tatooine house. As the Death Troopers emerged from the home, he reached out with the Force and made a fist. The house crumpled beneath his power, and the roof went caving down on the injured Kenobi who was inside. "Today will be a day long remembered," Vader told young Luke. The Imperial shuttle rose from the sand and left Tatooine. After defeating Obi-Wan on Tatooine, Darth Vader would take Luke to his castle in Mustafar to be trained in the ways of the Force. However, after murdering Owen and Beru, Luke would be terrified of Vader. But Luke would also understand that the only way he could survive was by learning from Vader. This would begin a hesitant path down the dark side for a young Luke. Vader would have to keep Luke a secret from the Emperor. The rule of two dictated that there could only be two Sith, a master and an apprentice. For Vader to train Luke as an apprentice would be a direct defiance of this rule and a threat to Palpatine. This situation would be similar to how Darth Maul was trained in secret by Palpatine before the death of Darth Plagueis. Now, Vader largely blamed Palpatine for the loss of Padme and his life the way it was before. Palpatine promised the power to save Padme from dying, but never delivered on that. The relationship between Sith Masters and their apprentices was tumultuous, but especially so in their case. The apprentice was taught to hate their master, and one day that hate would ultimately result in their betrayal. This was especially true of Vader and Sidious. Vader resented Sidious because he was the reason for much of his suffering. In The Empire Strikes Back, Vader wants his son to stand by his side as they rule the galaxy as father and son. This obviously means that Sidious would be overthrown by the two. In our story, this goal of Vader's remains, but now he has an early start to shape his young son into a powerful dark side user. Through his training, Luke would become powerful in the Force. He would quickly become what Anakin would have been had he not lost to Obi-Wan on Mustafar. But much like Darth Vader, Luke would have conflict. He was not a bad person. He had spent his childhood with Owen and Beru Lars before Vader murdered them, so Luke's dark side path would be motivated more by survival than a desire for power. Shortly after Luke was taken by Vader, Obi-Wan Kenobi would crawl out of the remains of the Lars home. Kenobi would have been severely injured, but the Force had protected him. He would feel that he had failed again. He lost the galaxy's only hope. Years before this, he had failed Anakin, and now he had failed Luke. Consumed by guilt and shame, Obi-Wan would contact Yoda on Dagobah. He would explain how Vader found and took Luke from Tatooine. And despite Obi-Wan's despair, Yoda would be optimistic because there was another option. Luke's twin sister Leia could be the hope they needed. The book, from a certain point of view, shares a bunch of short stories from different characters during The Empire Strikes Back, and if you haven't read it, you definitely should. It adds an incredible amount of depth to The Empire Strikes Back and all the characters in that movie. I've been listening to it on Audible while I drive. If you want to check this out for free, follow this link for a free trial of Audible and you can listen to hundreds more Star Wars novels. Anyways, back to my point. In this book, Yoda and Obi-Wan both preferred to train Leia over Luke. They saw too much of Anakin's impulses and recklessness in Luke. Realizing that Leia is now their only hope, Obi-Wan would contact Bail Organa, who was the adopted father of Leia. Obi-Wan would travel to Alderaan and begin training Leia in the ways of the Force. Now, let's jump ahead 10 years. So far, all of the events in this what-if scenario have taken place roughly in the decade before the events of A New Hope. Now let's fast forward to the point where A New Hope would take place. Luke has been operating as Vader's secret assassin, much like Starkiller did in Legends. Luke is carrying out secret missions under Vader's direct command, and his actual identity would be unknown to the Rebellion, but his reputation would strike fear in the Rebel Alliance. Luke's path down the dark side had been hesitant at first, but when Darth Vader revealed that he was his father, Luke wondered if the dark side was his destiny. Further, the dark side consumes its users. Even though Luke was hesitant to head down this path earlier in his training, at this point, the dark side had drawn him in and consumed him much like it did to Anakin. Meanwhile, Leia has spent nearly a decade training with Obi-Wan. They spent the early years of training on Alderaan, but soon left for Dagobah, where Yoda would have a hand in her training as well. And as you can imagine, with both Obi-Wan and Yoda training her, Leia would become a powerful Jedi by the time of A New Hope. With the rumors and the reputation of Vader's secret assassin growing, Leia would be eager to get out and face them. This would lead her masters to reveal the true identity of Vader and this assassin. Now, in the original timeline, this information was kept from Luke because Obi-Wan and Yoda did not want Luke to have an emotional investment in Vader. This emotional layer was a huge component to Anakin's fall, and the two masters assumed it would lead Luke down the same path. In our story, we're going to assume that after a decade of training, Leia would prove herself strong enough and wise enough to hear the truth about her family. After receiving this news, Leia would request Yoda and Obi-Wan's blessing to join the rebellion's fight against the Empire. An opportunity to join would quickly present itself. At this moment, the rebellion is gathering its forces to aid the Rogue One crew on Scarif. Now, just like the original timeline, Jyn Erso and Cassian Andor lead an attack on the Imperial base of Scarif with the hopes of stealing the plans to the Death Star. In Rogue One, Bail returns to Alderaan to have Leia find Obi-Wan Kenobi, but obviously in our story the two are already together. So at Bail's request, Leia would leave Dagobah to aid the rebel attack on Scarif. Yoda would give his blessing, saying that she was ready to reveal herself to the galaxy. Feeling that the time was right for him to rejoin the fight against evil, Obi-Wan would also join Leia. The two Jedi would arrive at Scarif just as the plans were being beamed up from the planet to the fleet. At this moment, Darth Vader's Star Destroyer would also arrive, carrying both Vader and Luke. Now, the events of Scarif would play out much like they did in the original timeline. The rebels would receive the plans aboard Admiral Raddus's MC-75 star cruiser, the Profundity. However, Vader's Star Destroyer would disable the rebel ship, leaving it open for boarding. Luke and Vader would storm the ship, chasing after the rebels who were making their escape. And just before reaching the docking tunnel to the Tantive 4, the power would go out, trapping the rebels in the hallway. This would give Vader and Luke time to catch up to the fleeing rebels. The hallway would light up red from the ignition of two crimson blades. The massacre of the rebel soldiers would begin. Vader would lead the attack with his son closely following. But deep down, Luke felt uneasy about the attack. He could sense the fear of the rebels. More than that, he sensed a resolve in them he had never felt before. They were willing to give their lives for their cause. It was a selfless sacrifice that perplexed Luke. As the dark duo approached the final rebel soldiers, The door at the end of the hallway suddenly swished open. The rebels holding onto the data card fell at the feet of two cloaked figures. The crimson glow of the hallway was now offset by the glow of blue. Vader and Luke paused. Obi-Wan Kenobi and Leia walked past the rebel soldiers. They now stood between the desperate rebels and the impending doom that was Vader and his assassin. Luke and Leia would duel each other while Obi-Wan and Vader faced off. But this time was different. Kenobi resolved to buy time for the rebels to escape. There was nothing more that he could teach Leia. This was his time to finally confront Vader for the last time. Through this, Kenobi knew that he must let Vader strike him down. The old Jedi looked at his former apprentice. Though he could not see Anakin's eyes, he knew that Anakin saw him through the black helmet. As their duel paused, Obi-Wan looked at Vader and said, "Strike me down, and I shall become more powerful than you could possibly imagine." With all eyes on Vader and Kenobi, the Sith Lord swung his lightsaber through the old Jedi. Leia shouted in anger, but quickly she composed herself and used the Force to push Luke and Vader further down the hall. Luke was thrown back, but Vader barely moved. Still, this provided just enough time for Leia and the surviving rebels to escape onto the Tantive 4, leaving Vader and Luke to watch the rebels flee with the Death Star plans. Vader sat in his meditation chamber. Thoughts swirled around his head. Thoughts of his son Luke, who had grown powerful in the Force. Thoughts of Luke's mother Padme. But these were weak thoughts. These thoughts belonged to Anakin Skywalker, and Anakin Skywalker was dead. For a short moment, Vader thought about the life Anakin almost had, but soon the twisted smile of Palpatine offering empty promises haunted his thoughts. Rage began to fill the normally serene meditation chamber. Vader clenched his fists and the room began to shake. But then Vader calmed. His anger made him powerful. It gave him focus. Vader began to think of the young Jedi that was with Obi-Wan Kenobi, Leia. The Force was telling him something about her. He could feel the connection between Luke and Leia. At this point, nothing mattered but hunting her down and ending Kenobi's legacy. Leia's ship entered the tractor beam of the Death Star. As her ship touched down, a squad of stormtroopers forms up in front of her. Vader's dark apprentice, Luke, is standing at the front of the ranks. Now, at this point in the story, the Empire does not know that Luke is leaking information to the Rebel Alliance, but Leia knows, and she has bet everything on the hope that Luke will help her defeat the Emperor and Darth Vader. Luke waves the stormtroopers away. This was a prisoner he could handle himself. So he takes Leia to a holding cell, and on the way he tells her that she shouldn't have come, but he will help her escape. He tells Leia that there are some final preparations he must make if they are going to escape. However, Leia tells him that her plan is not to escape, but to put an end to Vader and the Emperor. Looking at the ground, Luke sighs, and tells her that even if they work together, they would not be strong enough to defeat the two Sith Lords. As they approach a cell in the Death Star's detention level, Luke tells Leia that he is sorry for what happened to her master, Obi-Wan, the destruction of Chandrila, and everything else. His apology is genuine. He then explains that she must wait in this cell until he returns. Thrown off by his apology, Leia chooses to trust Luke in this moment, and she enters the cell. The doors slide shut behind her, but before they do, she hears Luke say he won't be long. At that moment, the Rebel Alliance exits hyperspace. The attack on the Death Star is about to happen. In this story, the Rebels had just a bit more time to prepare for this attack. The sudden destruction of Chandrila forced the Alliance to take action a bit earlier than even they thought was wise. But this time, instead of the Empire coming to them, they would come to the Empire. There were a handful of battlecruisers and frigates commanded by Admiral Akbar, while there were several fighter squadrons commanded by Hera Syndulla and Wedge Antilles. The plans recovered from Scarif revealed a weakness in the station's design. According to the team that had recovered these plans, it was an intentional flaw placed by the chief engineer Galen Erso. Hera Syndulla would lead her fighters against the main defense systems of the Death Star, including the swarms of TIE fighters, while Wedge Antilles would lead his squad down the trench toward the exhaust port. Leia sat on the floor of the dark cell. She could sense the battle outside beginning. But now was her chance to commune with the Force and prepare herself for the deadly duel of her life. Luke returned to get Leia. Leia tried to ask Luke what he was doing, but Luke simply responded by telling her he had to get some things that would be essential to the Emperor's destruction. Meanwhile, the battle between the Rebel fleet and the Death Star continued to rage on. The Rebel ships were barely making a dent in laser cannon defenses, and now swarms of TIE fighters had been deployed. The Rebel fleet was certainly being stretched beyond their capacity in this fight. Inside the Death Star, Luke and Leia stood silent in the elevator that was taking them to Palpatine's throne room. This was the moment that would define the Skywalker twins. The elevator opened to reveal an open room with a throne at the top of the steps leading to a window into space. Beyond that window, flashes of red and green dotted the outside space, revealing the gruesome battle between the rebels and the Empire. Seated on the dark throne was Emperor Palpatine, and Vader stood behind him. As Luke and Leia approached the throne, Palpatine stood up to greet them. "Welcome, young Jedi. We've been expecting you." Luke stepped to the side as Palpatine came face to face with Leia. Luke knew at this point to stay out of Palpatine's way. Luke watched as the Emperor taunted Leia, telling her soon she would belong to him just as Luke and Vader belonged to him. Angry at hearing this, Luke began to reach for his lightsaber. He'd make his move now, against his better judgment, knowing that Leia would quickly follow. They probably wouldn't stand a chance, but Luke was sure that he could at least take out the Emperor in this moment. But before he could unclip his lightsaber, the strong hand of his father rested on his shoulder. Confused, Luke looked at Vader, who nodded in confirmation. And suddenly, in one fluid moment, Darth Vader lunged and activated his crimson lightsaber in Palpatine's back. Leia was face to face with Palpatine as a look of shock overtook the old man's face. Vader deactivated his lightsaber as the frail body of Palpatine fell to the ground. The Emperor was dead. Vader looked at Leia, and without acknowledging the game-changing moment that had just taken place, he simply said, "Join us, daughter, and together we can rule this galaxy as a family." But Leia didn't know how to respond. She came here to bring an end to the leaders of the Empire, not help the second-in-command crown himself Emperor. After a moment, she raised her lightsaber and looked up at Vader. "I'll never join you. The Empire has to come to an end." And then she swung her saber at Vader. The Sith Lord's red lightsaber met hers just in front of his helmet. As their duel began, Luke stepped off to the side, conflicted. He had spent so much time hating his father, but with the Emperor dead, he could feel that his father was free of a hold that has controlled his life for so long. Luke could sense the conflict in his father. There was good in him. And of course, Leia knew none of this, so she was going to fight to the death. But Luke knew it would be to her death if he didn't intervene. As Leia and Vader fought inside the Death Star, the Rebel Alliance continued to fight an uphill battle against the Death Star's outer defenses. The Rebels could not make any progress towards the Death Star. If something did not change soon, the Rebel fleet would be cut to pieces within the hour. After watching the duel between his father and sister, Luke finally made a decision. He resolved the conflict within him. Using the Force, Luke pushed both Vader and his sister into the wall behind them. Luke began to plead with Leia. He had their attention for only a moment. He explained the conflict he could still feel in his father. Leia was hesitant to hear, but she looked into Luke's eyes and saw that he felt something within Vader. Both Vader and Leia agree to end the duel. He then goes to explain that Palpatine is a threat, still. In his arrogance, Palpatine had shown Luke the Sith holocron that revealed the location of Exegol. He even shared some of his contingency plan in case he was ever killed. Now, Palpatine's goal in doing this was really because he thought that Luke would replace Vader very soon. In his arrogance, he thought that Luke was completely loyal to him. Luke continued to explain that Palpatine could sense Vader's conflict growing over the last few years, and he knew that one way or another, Vader would betray him. So that's why he told Luke about Exegol as another layer to his contingency. He wanted Vader's son to be loyal to him. But Palpatine's arrogance blinded him to the fact that Luke was too much like his mother Padme. Deep down, he cared about his father. Luke, Leia, and Vader agreed to work together to destroy the Emperor's contingency. While Leia had been held in the detention center of the Death Star, Luke had gone to overload the Death Star's outer defense system. In a matter of minutes, the Death Star would be defenseless, and that would give the rebels an advantage and hopefully seal their victory. Aboard an Imperial shuttle, the trio exited the Death Star and slipped through the battle that was beginning to shift to the rebels' favor. Using the Sith holocron that Vader had, they made their way to Exegol. Here they discovered Palpatine's cloning facility. Because they had arrived so quickly, that meant that Palpatine had not yet been able to complete this contingency. His followers were scrambling to salvage anything they could in order to bring their master back. However, Luke, Leia, and Vader allowed none of it. In a rage reminiscent of his slaughter on Mustafar, Vader slashed through everyone he came across. Soon, none of Palpatine's followers remained. Now there was no hope of Palpatine returning. The rebels had been successful in destroying the Death Star, and this gave them the upper hand in the war against the Empire. It would take some more time for the Empire to completely fall to the rebels, but with the Emperor dead and Vader and Luke incognito, the rebels would begin to take victory after victory, thus winning the war and bringing about the New Republic. Despite the role they had played in bringing down Palpatine and the Empire, Vader and Luke would not be able to return to the rebels as heroes like Leia could. Instead, they had to go into hiding for the time being. Leia returned as the Jedi hero who single-handedly brought an end to the Emperor and his twisted empire. Eventually, Luke would be able to join his sister in rebuilding the Jedi Order, but Anakin would remain in hiding for the rest of his life. But he was okay with this. Finding solitude, he was able to commune with his old masters, Obi-Wan, Yoda, Qui-Gon. The dark side had twisted him and corrupted him, but in time, the light side would heal more than just his body, but his spirit as well. Well, I hope you enjoyed this fanfic. I'm sure there are things that you would do differently. There's even things I would do differently. Anytime I do one of these fanfics, I always write it and make the video, and I listen through it again, and I think, oh, I could do that differently. But that's part of the fun of the process, is always thinking about what the story could look like. Let me know in the comments below what you'd like to see over the next few months on the channel. I took quite the break to recalibrate, but I sure miss this community, so I'm glad to be back. I'll see you in the next video, and may the Force be with you.